We are joined today by Jim Olson. He is a former chief communications officer of many, many companies, from Starbucks to Avelo to United Airlines to US Airways, now American Airlines, and I'm sure so many others that I didn't say. And he is also now a author, soon to be published, coming up soon, and public speaker. So grateful to have you here, Jim.
Rachel, it's great to see you again.
So wanted to have Jim on because Jim, like I just said, has worn so many different hats, and he's really a very recognized and well-respected communications advisor, particularly in area of aviation and food and beverage and crisis communications and C-suite communications. And he's also been able to take those skills with him on his path in writing an amazing book that's coming out soon. So Jim, tell us where to start in having people get to know you. This is actually your second go around on Pursuit Perspectives. You were here a couple of years ago too. Well, you were really in the thick of Avelo and launching Avelo during COVID.
Yeah. So it's a kind of it's kind of an unfolding story, right? That's how stories are, right? So so much is the same and so much is different since the last time we talked. Well, first of all, just thanks again for having me on, and congratulations on the birth of your daughter and
Thank you.
And your expanding family. Well, look, probably I think the best place to start is kind of at the beginning of the kind of the latest chapter of my journey, which the most notable aspect of that, as you mentioned last time we talked, I was the head of communications, chief communications officer at Avelo Airlines, which was when it launched in April of 2021, was America's first new airline in 15 years. About 3 to 4 years into that journey, in January of 2024, I was diagnosed with a totally unexpected cancer diagnosis, a stage 4 metastatic melanoma tumor on my lung and on my brain, which is very hard. I never imagined I'd even be saying those words. It's still hard for me to even articulate those. When I was first diagnosed, I mean, just all the things you can imagine rushed through your head. And melanoma does not have a good reputation historically for survival, which is the bad news side of the story. The good news side is that that's kind of a little bit of an old movie or an old film. There have been some pretty extraordinary life-changing breakthroughs in medicine since then. So there's a new technology called immunotherapy, which is a offspring of chemotherapy, but unlike chemotherapy, which is still used extensively, which is like a nuclear bomb, which kills civilians and the bad guys kind of all at once and has all those detrimental side effects. Immunotherapy is much like a 21st century drone attack. It really just kind of goes after the bad stuff, and the good stuff, for the most part, I think the plan is at least that it kind of stays, immune from the attack. So they put me on a combination of immunotherapy and radiation to zap the brain tumor. These were sizable tumors. It was 2.5 inches on the lung, 1.5 inches on the brain. The great news is the brain tumor went away in about 3 months with one zap of radiation, which is pretty miraculous.
Unbelievable.
The lung tumor, the immunotherapy was pretty magical as well. In the first 6 months, it shrunk about 70%. Now, as a crisis management expert, I have this saying that I share with companies and organizations and leaders that when it gets worse, it's going to get worse. And a lot of people say it's going to get better before it gets, or it's going to get worse before it gets better. I just say it's going to get worse before it gets worse. And that was certainly the case here. Survivors and friends of survivors and fellow cancer warriors had warned me that cancer is a very sneaky, unpredictable demon that will surprise you in probably not only the most unexpected ways, but in some very painful ways. Even when you think you might have won, you're still in the battle. And so in July of 2024, so about 6 months after this journey started, one of the side effects of immunotherapy can be, not for everybody, so I want to be very careful here to not discourage people from using immunotherapy, but can be dramatic swings in blood pressure. And one of the implications of a very dramatic swing in blood pressure can be micro seizures or strokes that you might not even realize in the middle of the night. But in my case, one of the side effects of a micro stroke or seizure can be detrimental loss to your sight or optic nerve damage in my case. And so even though I had slayed the brain tumor and was basically 80 yards down the field on the lung tumor, this was kind of one of the casualties of my battle. And so for those that aren't familiar with optic nerve damage, which I was not familiar with before, it's not your eyes themselves, it's the cords that go from your eyes to your brain. And so when there's a disruption of blood or oxygen flow to those, it can cause either total or significant loss of sight. So in my case, what I'm seeing right now, Rachel, is if anyone listening or watching this has ever had their eyes dilated at the eye doctor, you get that kind of that blurriness as they're dilated. Mm-hmm. You can still see shapes and things, but you can't, like, if you have to put your phone like 1 inch from your face, everything's just very extremely blurry. It's like wearing your grandparents' glasses, like on a double prescription, right? So it's permanent right now until Elon Musk or somebody else comes up with a breakthrough. I'm kind of stuck with this, but I've learned to adapt. And one of the ways I learned to adapt was by writing this book, which we can talk about in a minute. But I'll just put a pin in this, and then we can move on to whatever the next conversation or continuous conversation is. The good news is that as of December of last year, they took me off the immunotherapy, did a final dusting with radiation of the lung. And a year ago, December, they had basically gotten rid of both the tumor on the lung and the brain. And my latest results as of this last December, both remain in remission. So
fabulous.
The fight is never really, as cancer warriors know, the fight's never over, but the enemy is at bay right now. So.
Yeah, an unbelievable change of events, truly. And, from going from, you always said like flying high, and you always have your aviation analogies, always just being on the go. And you're really excited at your most recent venture at Avelo. Tell us a little bit about what you accomplished there. And then we can get into, the path of aviation and kind of how it relates to, I feel like, the message of your book too.
Yeah, well, Avelo was an extraordinary experience. I had, as you noted at the beginning, so I had held senior posts at Starbucks and U.S. Airways and United. My most recent big venture prior to Avelo was I was the chief comms officer at United Airlines, the largest airline in the world. One of the individuals I met there, who was also on the leadership team, was Andrew Levy, who was the chief financial officer there. We were there for the same period of time. We left at about the same time. And I turned 50 and moved my family to Africa and did an executive residency at a university there for a little over a year till COVID screwed that up. And he did something really substantial, like went out and raised an initial round of funding to start America's first new airline, which ultimately became Avelo. And he kind of pulled me out of the margins from teaching back into the front lines of the airline industry to.
Oh, right. You had gone back then you moved to Syracuse.
Yeah. So I was teaching at Syracuse, which is our shared alma mater, Newhouse School. So plug to go Orange.
And go
Newhouse. But look, I was teaching. I thought that was kind of going to be my thing. I really enjoyed teaching and was really enjoying that. But despite my efforts to continue teaching, I also love the airline industry. You kind of never really get just kind of like being a Syracuse Orange, you never really get the orange flowing from your veins. You never really get the jet fuel out of your veins as an airline executive. And so Andrew was very convincing and persuasive. After helping him launch the airline as a consultant, I went on the very first inaugural flight of the airline. I was back on the ramp. This is kind of in the peak of COVID, which is another incredible story in itself, to launch an airline in the middle of COVID, which was the biggest trough in airline travel in American history. But I basically was like an alcoholic. I fell off the wagon. I was back working with journalists and people that I hadn't worked with in several years. And I cried uncle and I jumped back in. And, it was an amazing ride. I was there for almost 5 years, and we grew from 3 airplanes and probably about 10 markets when we launched and about 50 employees to flying to basically across the country in 60 destinations or more, and having about 20 or 25 airplanes and 1,200 employees by the end of it. And so really proud of what we accomplished there. But I had a bigger mission to go accomplish after that period. And left in May of last year to finish writing my book and start building out my speaking platform and doing a little consulting on the side.
Right, and so for some context too, after this series of curveballs, to say the least, hit you and you had the 3 months off, you started writing your book and then you went back and then you decided that you want to finish the book and kind of go in that direction. Is that right?
Yeah, so just to kind of reset the time frame. So like I said, in January of 2024, I was diagnosed with a cancer. In July of 24, 6 months later, I got hit blindsided with this just, life shattering blindness. I am legally blind. So I can say for people who aren't know, there's different shades of blindness, but my vision I don't drive and qualify in that category. And then when that hit, I did take, as you indicated, I did, first time in my career I ever kind of benched myself, for lack of a better metaphor, because I just felt like when this vision loss hit, I just was in a situation where I just felt like I was not able to contribute to the airline the way I needed to do as I kind of adapted. It was like a plane losing both engines at low altitude. I needed to kind of stabilize the situation. I talk in my book about this whole kind of metaphor that pilots learn when an in-flight emergency happens. Pilots like Sully, and I was at US Airways when Sully put the plane on the Hudson River. Every pilot, whether civilian or military or commercial, learns aviate, navigate, and communicate when you have an in-flight emergency. So I felt like I was having an in-flight emergency in my own life. And so I had to aviate. I had to stabilize the situation. That's what pilots do when they have an in-flight emergency, whether it's a fire, a hydraulic issue. They just keep the plane in the air. You got to just keep flying the plane and not really worry about anything else. Because if you don't fly the plane, you're not going to have time to navigate or communicate. So that's kind of what I had to do. I felt like even worse than the cancer, but even though it really wasn't worse than the cancer, I felt like I had to stabilize my situation with this vision loss. And then so I did go to the coach. I went to Andrew Levy, the CEO, and said, I've got to bench myself. I'm going to pull the cord on short-term disability to kind of just figure out what's going on with my vision and readapt and so that I can come back and be the full force contributor that I was previously. And so that was in many ways the best thing I could do. I mean, if there's one message for people out, I've got a lot of messages, but one is there's no shame in. I felt a lot of shame in the beginning in doing that because I've never quit anything in my life before, and so there was a bit of shame in having to go to your coach or your CEO and saying, I'm not capable of doing this job, and having, and being able to do that. And so some people might call that courage. It was what I needed to do. And it was the best thing I ever did. So one of the first big lessons from this whole conversation is if you feel like you need to take that time, and there are other people in my book that I talk about that had to do that as well, you should take that time because it's there for a reason. That short-term disability is there to be your aviate period in your career and your life, to stabilize your situation, regain the momentum of your airplane so that you can figure out where you're going to navigate. In my case, I was able to ultimately go back to work, and I did 24 press conferences and learned how to navigate in this new kind of world of high vision loss. But I also, during that period, wrote the book. I didn't finish the book, but I got most of it done and went back to work and showed myself in the world that you can be a senior executive, a chief communications officer in a high-flying industry like the airline industry as a blind person. And ultimately, once I did that, I thought in last May, decided, you know what, I have a bigger mission. I've got to finish this book and share the story.
Right. And so tell us about your book.
Yeah, so the book is called Tailwind, A Compass for Turning Your Setback Story into Your Comeback Legacy. And it is not a memoir. It is not, my picture's not on the cover. There's, yes, my story is in there as kind of a jumping off point. But it's also got the stories of 12 to 15 other people, including you, Rachel, and your extraordinary setback to comeback story. And so that's really what my intention was, there's such a diversity of storms that people face in their lives. I wanted people, when they read the book, I wanted, regardless of what stage in life you're in, what walk of life you come from, whatever ethnicity you come from, part of the world you come from, I want you to be able to at least relate to somebody in some way in the book. Because if it was just the Jim Olson story, you might go, well, that's an interesting story about this middle-aged white guy who had cancer. But I'm a 25-year-old management consultant at McKinsey going through a divorce. And so there really is a traumatic story and a person in there. I think when you hold the book up, you'll see kind of a mirror of yourself or someone in there. And it's not a magic quadrant. It's not designed to be a GPS to solving everyone's problems. I don't make that claim, but that's why I call it a compass. Because if you think about a compass in the most like authentic sense, the needle really kind of just bounces around a little bit. It gives you a sense of direction, but it really isn't it doesn't give you it's not a modern day GPS that plots out the exact route and avoids traffic jams. Just like a compass, right? It'll tell you what direction, but a compass doesn't tell you whether there's another storm ahead of you. It just tells you you're heading north, south, southeast. And that's really the intention of the book. Like it's not intended to be a perfectly clean Tesla. It's like a 1979 Alfa Romeo that still comes with a tight clutch and some, and a clunky steering wheel, right? So that's kind of the intent, is to give people a compass in these 10 compass headings for navigating the storms in their lives, whatever those are.
Yeah, and I think that's what I think is really amazing, is when you think about your career, you have always been a storyteller, and you are navigating, helping plane, like it's just such a good way of approaching it, because you've also been helping airlines, Starbucks, all these major organizations. They've had their fair share of storms. It feels like my impression of your career is that there's a lot of proactive communications, there's a lot of internal, but perhaps because of the nature, particularly of aviation, there's a lot of crises, right?
Yeah, and that's really what it is. At the end of the day, when people ask me what kind of book is it, it's a crisis management book, but it's a crisis management book that can basically, be a back pocket field guide for individuals, that I was just saying, who might be going through a personal or health crisis of some kind, or maybe they lost their house in a natural disaster. So it's designed for individuals. It's designed for leaders, right? Because leaders face crises of various kinds in their organizations and their teams, and for organizations. So not just for companies, but nonprofits or associations or synagogues or churches, government agencies. So at the end of the day, this framework that I use, for lack of a better term, of that aviate, navigate, communicate crisis management protocol that pilots use, I discovered is a very applicable framework that individuals and leaders can use in essentially any situation. I would challenge folks to tell me, a situation where it wouldn't be applicable. And so that's kind of my goal, is to equip individuals and leaders with this aviate, navigate, and communicate framework that they can then embrace for their own organizations.
I love that. Yeah. And so what are some examples of anything that you can talk about? Maybe you could talk about when you were working and you were part of the plane on the Hudson River. I think, was it 2009?
Yep.
Was that 2009?
Yeah, 2009. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good example.
It was this month of 2009.
So what was like an example of how that applied in like the aviation landscape for people to kind of wrap their heads around?
Yeah. So I'll give it in the purest sense, like how Sully applied it, which is really where the light bulb went off for me to apply it to individual and business use. And then I'll kind of switch gears outside the aviation industry, because I really want people to go, well, I don't work in the aviation industry. Yeah. This isn't applicable to me. So I'll talk to you about a real world situation that also was in January. Believe it or not, like I'm just going to rename January Crisis Month for Jim Olson, because just really crises seem to happen in my world in January. So stay away. You
better enjoy the holidays.
So if you think about that metaphor of aviate, navigate, communicate, just to remind folks of what happened on that date on January 15th, Sully takes off from LaGuardia Airport. It's supposed to be a 2-hour flight down to Charlotte on an Airbus A320 aircraft, about 150 people and 5 crew members on board. They take off, perfectly clear day in Manhattan. For those who've taken off from LaGuardia, you take off and you fly right over downtown Manhattan. And about 1,500 feet or so, 2,000 feet after, just really about probably a minute and a half after taking off, a flock of Canada geese, which are these big, meaty, feathery geese that had been migrating, get sucked into the engines on this.
No, I don't remember that at all.
Yeah. And so, Both, yeah, exactly. So both engines, Lily, imagine at low altitude, you're looking out the window, you're maybe just starting to slip your shoes off, and you can still literally see the cars on the ground. I mean, that's how close to the ground they were. And
Right.
all of a sudden, you know from flying a lot yourself that takeoff is when the plane's the loudest. You just have the thrust of the engines, even with your noise canceling headphones. You just feel it's hard to watch your movie or listen to music. And so all of a sudden, imagine the opposite happening. The plane just goes silent. The engines are just dead. There's no thrust. It turns into a glider. And so Sully just instinctively, because he's such a well-trained pilot, and Jeff Skiles, who was his first officer, co-pilot, they aviated. Which is the number one rule in flight school when something happens, aviate, which is basically translating to stabilize the situation, keep the plane flying. And what they did was they instinctively put the nose down. Instead of trying to pull up, you would think as you're kind of going towards the ground with no thrust, you'd want to pull up. They did the opposite. They put the nose down to regain momentum, like a bike going down a hill, so they'd have more time. And that by aviating, that gave him the time to figure out where he was going to navigate. So if you listen to those transcripts, which are available online, you'll hear Sully talking to the air traffic controller and figuring out where he's going to land. And so he literally decides, okay, he can't go back to LaGuardia, can't go to JFK, all the winds. He's doing all these calculations real time, real fast. And he ultimately decides he has to land on the Hudson River. So he navigated. He figured out, like, he aviated, bought the time, figured out where he needed to land. He navigated on the Hudson River. And last and not least, he finally gets on the intercom. The last thing he does about 30 seconds before the plane splashes down in the Hudson was he gets on the intercom to talk to the flight attendants and the passengers and says, "This is your captain, brace for impact." And so he aviated, navigated, and ultimately communicated. And so that was a casebook example in terms of how to follow that just classic piloting framework.
Right.
But to give you an example outside of the aviation world, in the crisis communications world, if you fast forward several years, in January of 2016, when I was at Starbucks and leading their global corporate communications, I was on a 2-week tour of Asia with our CEO, Howard Schultz, and a couple of other executives. And the last stop on the tour was India. And so we're in Mumbai, meeting with the Tata Group, and Howard's getting ready, which is our partner there, and we're getting ready to go out on stage, and he was going to give this big speech, and we're in the green room, and all of a sudden our phones start lighting up. And it was about the same day. I think it might have been around January 15th, but several years later. And our phones light up, and it was one of those 9/11 moments where we saw pictures of our store in Jakarta, Indonesia, with the headline, "Starbucks targeted by ISIS." And literally smoke, billowing out of one of our stores, the windows shot. I mean, our store had literally been like just decimated, our flagship store in Jakarta. And so we ultimately, Howard went on stage and did give a speech, and then we kind of rehuddled as a group. And so we aviated. We kind of figured out we stabilized the situation. We didn't do a knee-jerk reaction. We, initially Howard, just instinctively being the courageous leader that he wanted to get on his plane and fly down to Jakarta and be there. Which, when your brand is under attack, and the suggestion, which ended up being incorrect, which is another crisis rule, that usually the first information is wrong because it was not Starbucks that was under attack. But you don't fly, you don't fly your CEO right into the heart of the battle when when there's basically a war going on with ISIS in Jakarta. So, but we stabilized the situation, right? We followed the Aviate rule. So we aviated and we figured out, okay, let's just kind of get all the information, talk to our folks on the ground in Indonesia, figure out what our plan is. And so then we ultimately decided that I would parachute into Jakarta. So we leave the plane in behind. I get on a commercial flight fly into Jakarta, and that I would be the one that would kind of sort out I'd be the one kind of navigating and figuring out what to do. So we're now in the navigation phase. So I parachuted into Jakarta.
Scary.
Yeah, and so I get there, and by this point, by the time I get there, the Army had stabilized the situation. They either killed or arrested the terrorists who had done this horrible attack on our store, and it was basically ended up turning out there was it was a booby trap to lure the Army in, and then ISIS their main target was the Army and the police. And so they had snipers that were taking out the police as they came to kind of rescue people at Starbucks. And so long story short, oh my God. Once I got on the ground there, I worked with the chief of police, our local leadership there. And so we navigated, we figured, okay, where are we going to go from here? What are we going to do now? And we figured out our message, how we're going to recalibrate things, and most importantly, how we're going to care for our customers and our employees, our partners, as we call them, that were impacted by this situation. And one of the key things we decided to do was shut down all of our stores across the entire country. We flew in all of those, flew or drove in all the partners or employees from all these other stores into Jakarta, which is where this attack had happened. And we ultimately rented out a ballroom. So Howard, we ultimately decided, as we went through this navigation phase, that Howard would fly in under the cloak of darkness in the middle of the night to meet all of our employees, because that's the kind of courageous leader that he is. And he flew in, and we had this ballroom meeting with 2,000 of our employees from across the country. Gave this just heartwarming, I wouldn't even call it a speech, just this conversation with all of these employees that had been impacted. And he'd also gone to the hospital to visit some of the employees and customers that had been impacted. But that's where the communication came in, right? So we aviated that, just getting back to the framework, how it worked. We aviated in India, we stabilized the situation, figured out what we were going to do. We got to India, or got to Jakarta. I got there, worked with the police, collaborated with them to figure out, okay, how we're going to navigate and what are the next steps and shoes to fall and all this kind of stuff. And then finally we communicated. We brought together all of our employees and did this mega town hall with all of our employees and
wow.
So I just kind of use that as an example of outside the airline, where how that metaphor of how we communicate works in any situation.
Yeah. That's and does the aviate meaning also like keep moving, right? Like keep the plane moving. I think that's an interesting parallel to when you're feeling stuck or you're having a crisis, whether it's business or professional. Like you kind of need to keep moving in a direction, but when it comes to this side of the business side, communication, you don't want to move too quickly where you have the wrong information too. So that's kind of tricky.
Yeah, well, I think that's probably the most important thing. That's why the communicate comes last, right? Because I think one of the, and I've been a victim of this myself, one of the biggest mistakes we make when we feel like the walls caving in around us in this new world of, it's not really a new world anymore, but this world of social media and political pressure, there is a lot of pressure. It's like if you've ever gone like scuba diving or snorkeling, the pressure just kind of coming in around you as you kind of go down to deeper levels, right? And that's kind of what you feel like when you're in the boardroom, when there's a major crisis happening. You feel that pressure to communicate.
Right.
And really the Aviate part of that framework is really designed just by keeping the plane flying. That's a metaphor. If your organization's facing an active shooter, you really need to be focused first and foremost on the safety of your employees and your customers and those that are maybe impacted by that situation. If it's a factory explosion, just making sure that the fire is contained and that the community is safe, right? So it's just that Aviate part is like, it seems counterintuitive to us that are communicators, right? We want to race to get a statement out or get a tweet or an X post out there, right? Or get an Instagram post out there. But, your first priority really should be human life and stabilizing the situation. And then, yes, you might get criticized later for being a little slow in getting a statement out there, but I'd rather get attacked for focusing on people's lives and well-being, a little slow on the gun and getting a statement out than getting the wrong information out, which is a mistake, and I've even made this before in some situations. You get a statement out there, and like I said before, 99% of the time, the first information that's out there about a crisis is wrong. And if you put a statement out there that's based on that first information, you can't really put the toothpaste back in the tube, as I like to say. And you're gonna have a second crisis on your hand, because then you're gonna have to be explaining why you put out misleading information during that first phase. So I don't know if that helps, but don't try to avoid the toothpaste back in the tube, because it's hard. It's pretty messy and hard to do.
And what does one do? Is there any sort of an interim communication, such as we're working on it, we're aware of the situation, we're gathering information, we're focusing on safety and well-being, or is it silent until you really figure it out? What do you recommend?
No, no. So it does absolutely means it does not mean go silent or radio silent.
Mm-hmm.
There is a way that you can still acknowledge the gravity of a situation, but without essentially providing any kind of explanation maybe of what happened. So you can certainly, if there is let's say you're working for a railroad, right, and there's a derailment, you can certainly, as the head of communications or the spokesperson, acknowledge that there has been an accident at X location involving one of our trains, for example, and that our top priority is the safety of the community and our staff that were potentially impacted by this derailment. We'll be getting more information out to you shortly.
Yes.
But that right there, like you've acknowledged, right? But you don't have to go into. There's gonna be tons of speculation. Was it the engineer who was at fault? Was it a terrorist attack?
All the details.
And that you can kind of keep at bay, and that's where you're going to get a lot of pressure, because then once you put that first statement out, you're just going to get flooded with questions, right? I've been there. I've been in the hot seat where the walls just start caving in, and that's where it takes that discipline to just keep aviating and navigating, and then kind of like Sully, then go into brace for impact. This is your captain, brace for impact, right? So I don't want people to think that Jim Olson saying, put your head in the sand and don't communicate. But there is a way you can frame that initial acknowledgement in a way that acknowledges the gravity of a situation, that does not appear tone deaf, but without necessarily accepting responsibility or explaining what happened and buying yourself the hours or the days that it might take to actually get the response that people are going to expect from you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And once you put some piece of information out there, if it's wrong, it's worse than delaying. Well, and like you also said, especially if there's safety involved, right? That's more important than getting bad press that you didn't respond right away to an email. Basically, it's essentially what it is. So at least get the priorities in order, and then from an information flow standpoint, putting something out wrong in today's day and age is very hard to unwind once it's out.
And I also like to say that, and this is why, like at Starbucks and United and U.S. Airways, the different crises we've faced, we haven't been perfect by any means, but we've certainly been on our game, is because I believe in this idea that crises aren't stressful, but not being prepared is stressful. And I think if you've run the traps, you've done the drills, you have a plan. You can't plan for everything. It's impossible. There's too many different things to plan for. But if you can at least do the planning where you have a tabletop mindset, where you at least have a crisis management mindset you've already walked through with your general counsel, with your CEO and your different leaders, regardless of what kind of crisis we have, whether it's an accident, active shooter, whatever it might be, here is kind of the mindset we're going to bring to the table to this situation. You don't want to be debating that kind of thing. Like the statement we just talked about, that acknowledgement, there's no time to be debating that approach in the moment of battle, right? And so one of the individuals I talk about in my book is this middleweight boxing champion of the world, Daniel Jacobs, who came back from a lethal cancer diagnosis, young professional boxer, and ultimately came back to win that championship belt. And he told me a great story, or a great, kind of lesson about boxing. He said, Jim, and I write about this in my book, the fight is never won in the ring. The fight is won long before we as fighters step into the ring. And basically what he was trying to say was it's all the training and the mental preparations and the conditioning and the diet and everything that goes into the years and months and weeks that lead up to that championship bout that determine whether you're going to win or lose that fight. And so it's kind of the same with crisis management, right? Like if you're not dieting right, if you're not training right, if you're not practicing, if you're not in the gym sparring with other cross-functional teams and doing all that kind of out of the ring or out of the arena preparation, then the crisis hits. your chances of winning in the ring when the fight happens are going to be pretty slim. So, I think the same is true in crisis management. The fight, I hate to use that metaphor, but really the crisis, the winning of hearts and minds and how you come out the other side on a crisis is going to be won long before you step into that actual crisis arena.
Well said. And it relates also back to your personal experience of your health journey. And, I've talked about in other contexts around, my experiences with grief and IVF and keeping that dedication to taking care of yourself and what you can control with how you sleep and how you eat and how you just, even when you're in a really stressful times in your life personally, like still being prepared. You're not doing it so that you're prepared for what's next necessarily, but it does certainly make you stronger and more resilient. In my case with the IVF, I talked a lot about, I was preparing, for my next battle with the treatment, or in business, right? You want to always be ahead of, you don't want to be stagnant. So, I spoke to Paul Kane, who's a major media executive, and he made a good point. Like once he feels like he figures it out, he realized he has to try something new.
Yeah.
You can't be complacent in the business setting. It always has to be ready for something new or to come your way.
Yeah, no, exactly right. You got to be ready. And then I think the other thing too, and it's totally kind of different example than you write about in your book, but you talk about this whole idea, one of your lessons from your father was this idea of follow-up, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the same is true in our communications world, whether it's crisis management or otherwise. I mean, I think crisis management though is a great example, right, on the follow-up side. This should be part of the training and the conditioning as well. It's a muscle that you have to kind of train and condition yourself to do. But that follow-up is key because the best way to end a crisis is with some kind of follow-up or action, right? Okay. So if you think about stories that kind of just continue to linger out there in the media, right, that just are like death by 1,000 cuts or death by 1,000 tweets or stories, right? The ones that just never seem, you're like, wow, this story is it's not going to age well, right? Because it's just like, the media just keep, another
new angles, new perspectives, new problems.
Yeah, that poor company or leader is just a punching bag, right? And but it finally ends when there's some kind of action taken by that leader, that organization, that politician. And when they finally the light bulb goes off, finally, if we do this, and it's pretty magical. You see it, the case studies are infinite, right? When a company finally does something, then the story goes away. The influencers and the media and everyone else finds something else. They find another shiny object to go chase, right? But until you, this whole idea of hoping it'll just go away and that they'll focus on something different in this kind of, short attention span world, I don't really buy that because I've lived in that world before, and I have seen how it really does take some kind of action on the part of the organization to really kind of put a pin in whatever the situation might be. So that I think that's where that follow-up kind of, you talk about that in your book, a whole different kind of example, but follow-up really is key on these situations. You can't just kind of get that initial response out or even that follow-up response. There has to be some kind of follow-up action.
What would be an example of a follow-up action?
Well, so for example, like when I was at United Airlines, it was a horrific situation where one of our customers, and it actually wasn't our plane, it was one of our regional airlines. So it was not actually our company, but it still was our brand. And this individual was just very violently, removed from the aircraft. I mean, you might recall that situation, right? And there's a whole kind of reasons that kind of led up to that. But at the end of the day, there were, the company acknowledges, so I'm not sharing anything that's not already out there, but it was bad policy that resulted in that cascading of events that happened that evening. And so we were kind of stuck in that vortex of just horrific media coverage for, a pretty long period of time. And what ultimately got us out of it took us a few days to do it, but it took us about 5 days. But we committed to doing an autopsy essentially on what happened that evening or the Sunday evening, and committing to by that following Monday, so a week later, having a full report, transparent report of our own internal audit of what happened and the
Wow.
action, and more importantly, the actions we were going to take to make sure that never would happen again. And you can look at the coverage out there that after we put that report out about a week later, because it took that long to really do our due diligence on what happened and the kinds of steps we were going to have to take to reverse policies, change policies, and initiatives. Once we put that report out there was a kind of a burst of coverage around the report, and people moved on to focusing on something else. So it was, again, great example of a crisis, something that was very dramatic, high profile, and then by taking some kind of action, which we did, here are the policy changes we're going to make. It was very tangible, right? And a tangible action. We were able to pivot from that crisis.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, and it seems like just in general, crises I've observed what you said. It's that twofold. It's the acknowledgement, like ultimately, of this is happening. That we are addressing this. We are looking into this. This did happen. Here's what's going to, it's not necessarily a real time minute. It doesn't have to be that minute by minute, play by play, I think is what you're saying, because you want to get it right. And there's so much to manage, but it is a bit of a play by play of keeping people along with you to the extent that the information's accurate. And, you can get the right information out there so that there's not this questions or anxieties or assumptions being made.
Yeah, just another simple example. When I was at Starbucks, we had a situation where the food coloring used in different frappuccinos and some of our beverages and cupcakes and stuff was a very common, extremely safe coloring called cochineal. It actually comes from Brazilian beetles. And most people don't know that, but maybe even the lipstick you're wearing, Rachel, is if you look at the ingredients, is from cochineal. Well, obviously, there is a community of folks that don't like the idea of any kind of animal product in their ingredient, including that of beetles. And just the idea that Starbucks was using anything with crushed beetles in it is not satisfactory for the brand. And so that's a great example of a story that just completely just exploded right from it was like a landmine that just blew up right under our feet. And it was about a 48-hour news cycle until we, again, made the decisive decision from the very top, from Howard Schultz, to remove that ingredient from our product and go to natural, like non-animal food coloring. And that it went away.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
And it was the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do for the brand as well. So it's not just, you shouldn't be doing these things because you want this. I want to be really clear on that. I'm not suggesting you should be doing these things just to simply respin the story or recast the story. Most of the time, companies and leaders, are doing these things, and they certainly should be doing them, not to try to make the story go away, but because whatever the crisis was, it exposed something that needed fixing, and they're actually taking action in the wake of the crisis to actually legitimately fix that problem, not because it's some kind of PR solution, but because it's actually the right thing to do for safety or other reasons.
That's a very important point that you made. That's a very important point. Yeah, do something about it. That you don't want it to happen again. So if it's exposed a weakness in your organization that could be a serious threat to well-being or whatever else may be, then you need to address it before it happens again.
Yeah, exactly. So there's lots of, again, you should never let a crisis go to waste, as Rahm Emanuel said, and again, not to use it as a PR opportunity, but as actually a operational opportunity or a leadership opportunity to actually fix a problem that you otherwise might not have been exposed to.
And kind of this full circle to this transformative shift that you've had, because you had this high-flying career. I feel like you always say, and you have these really good analogies. And last we saw you, you were head of communications at Avelo, launching something brand new, and you had something happen, and it was a crisis, and it exposed an operational weakness, right? But now you can do something about that too. And in your sharing your story with your book, It's going to help so many people, so many organizations, and actually take action on, weaknesses that you've seen that people have in their personal lives, businesses have in their professional, operations that you witnessed in your positions, and bring it together, because people are what makes up these organizations at the end of the day.
Yeah. Like I said, this whole aviate, navigate, communicate framework, it really is just a mindset. I talk about how by embracing that mindset, that's what got me through my crisis. I aviated by doing what the doctors told me to do just to stabilize my medical situation. I navigated by figuring, okay, I'm gonna actually like take this time off to kind of solve my vision issue, and kind of learn these new tools to thrive as a blind person. I'm going to communicate. I'm going to share my story, and I think that's really important. You write about this in your book too. It's really, everyone's different, right? So not everyone necessarily should, or I'm not saying everyone needs to share their story, but a big part of my communications section of my book, I have 5 chapters or 6 chapters dedicated to this, is essentially sharing my experiences as a storyteller and a communicator, and trying to equip folks that, like you and I, who have not been professionally trained as storytellers and communicators,
Right.
how to help them shape their story and tell their story. And I think the other piece too, because I know we are tight on time here, but the 4th section, which is not part of that aviate, navigate, communicate framework that pilots use, but it probably should be, but it's the 4th section of my book, is appreciate. So aviate, navigate, communicate, and appreciate. Because I really do think, whether it be in crisis management or just in business organizations or in our personal lives, that appreciate part is so important, right? We're not going to get through these problems or these crises by ourselves. Again, whether it's an individual crisis or a leadership crisis or an organizational crisis, it's going to take, I use this term a lot, like business is a team sport. Crisis management is a team sport. If you think you can get through it alone, you're not going to be able to. And so that section of appreciation really is a chance to just acknowledge that no matter how smart we are, no matter how strong we are, even that guy Daniel Jacobs I talked about, the fighter, right? One of the strongest young men in the world, right? Physically and emotionally, right? He's a professional boxer, but he got through his cancer crisis and back in the ring because of a team of medical professionals that cured him of his cancer, and other people around him, friends and family and coaches, that were able to punch by punch and pull up by pull up and mile by mile out on the track, was able to claw his way literally back into the ring and win that world championship title. And so I think that's a really just another important aspect of this, is that, the saying goes, it takes a team to make the dream. And I know in your journey as well, you've been surrounded by a constellation of folks that have helped you get through your journey, and the same's true. And that's the other thing I just try to remind people, whether in business or in life, just don't try this. Don't try this at home, but don't try this alone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you just have to reach out, I think. And I think it can be hard, just on the personal side of this, to reach out, but there are people, and the more you're sharing, I'm sure the more you're going to inspire people to share and to kind of open up and to seek out support too, if they haven't already done that, which would be beautiful. And, operate and manage their own, whether it's personal crisis, professional crisis.
And the time to make those friends, a lot of times, doesn't mean you're not going to meet new people. Like when I was in Jakarta, I met the chief of police in Jakarta for the first time. I really had no reason to get to know him beforehand. I had no idea that there was going to be a terrorist attack in Jakarta on one of our stores. But that said, if you are a company that has a headquarters or a strong foothold in certain markets, there is really no excuse for not building those relationships with stakeholders in those communities. Or with regulatory agencies, if you're like in the airline industry, or if you're in the energy industry, there's no excuse for not having just bulletproof relationships with the kinds of individuals and organizations and agencies and other partners that you're going to want to have at your side when that happens. So in the aviation world, for example, at U.S. Airways, one of the reasons that the flight 1549 splashed down in the Hudson was business, we called it a case study in crisis management. It was because our team, we had established deeply personal relationships with the National Transportation Safety Board. Well ahead of that, Peter Knudsen, who's the head of comms at the NTSB. I had already like established a relationship with him my first couple months on the job at US Airways. This accident happened 8 months into my watch, right? So I already had that relationship, which was instrumental. You already have a relationship with the FAA. You already have a relationship with the union leaders. Even though you might have contentions with some of these audiences, unions are a great example. And where like you might be in a highly unionized industry like the airline industry, and you might not see eye to eye on everything or even most things, but that's still, again, no reason not to break bread with these individuals ahead of time, where you can agree ahead of time that if there is an accident, we will see eye to eye. That for that period of time when we're trying to help our passengers, our employees, the members of your union, the members of the community that might have been impacted by that crash, there is no reason why we can't work arm in arm, hand in hand, in working through that crisis together. But you've got to do that hard work of sometimes swallowing your pride with people that you typically sit across the table from and may despise. But we're all human beings, and we can all, if you do it ahead of time, agree to put those disagreements aside when something really bad happens. But you got to do that ahead of time. The fight is won. Like I said, the fight is won, or as not I said, but as Daniel said, the fight is won before you even step in the ring.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for all that. Is there anything I did not ask you that you want me to cover?
No, I guess the big question, we talked about my book coming out maybe in February. When's your book coming out, Rachel? That's the big question, because I got for everyone here, I got a preview of it. It is a book that is a page turner, but more importantly, it's not a book, it's a gift. And I can't wait for people to read your book.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, it's written, so we'll taking it to the next steps and coming soon, hopefully in 2026. That's the goal.
Okay,
that will be the goal.
Get it done.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Appreciate it. Well, thank you for your second appearance on Pursue Perspectives. I think it's really cool, to see you're just, you keep going and keep inspiring us and keep teaching us. So thank you for sharing with us. We really appreciate it.
Rachel, it's always a pleasure to see you. I value our friendship, and you're just so proud of everything you've accomplished with your business. And as a fellow Newhouse person, proud to call you a fellow Orange. Go Orange.
Absolutely. Go Cuse. Thank you.